Stand on any street in Paris, London, New York, or Vienna and look up. The buildings surrounding you, ornate facades, soaring columns, intricate stonework, they tell a story that seems almost impossible. Because here's the thing that keeps architectural historians awake at night. Most of these structures were built in a single human lifetime. Between 1850 and 1900, the Western world underwent the most dramatic urban transformation in human history. Cities that had existed for centuries suddenly doubled, tripled, even quadrupled in size. Entire districts of monumental stone buildings appeared in decades. Paris was gutted and rebuilt. Chicago rose from prairie to metropolis in a generation. London expanded to become the largest city humanity had ever known. The scale is staggering. In 50 years, more urban construction occurred than in the previous 500 years combined. And this happened during an era we think of as primitive, before power tools, before modern engineering software, before cranes that could lift hundreds of tons. So how did they do it? How did Victorian society with hand tools and horse-drawn carts accomplish what seems to defy the laws of time and physics? This isn't conspiracy, it's one of history's most legitimate puzzles. The deeper we dig into construction records, labor statistics, and engineering reports, the more remarkable the achievement becomes. This is the story of the greatest building boom in human history and the extraordinary innovations, brutal labor conditions, and social upheaval that made it possible. Let's start with numbers that sound like exaggerations but aren't. In 1850, London had roughly 2.5 million residents. By 1900, it had 6.5 million. That's 4 million new people who needed homes, workplaces, shops, schools, hospitals, sewers, and streets. The city didn't just grow, it exploded outward and upward simultaneously. Paris tells an even more dramatic story. Between 1853 and 1870, Baron Haussmann's renovation demolished 12,000 buildings and constructed 40,000 new ones. In 17 years, roughly 60% of the buildings in central Paris were replaced. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. New boulevards carved through medieval districts like surgical incisions. New York built its iconic brownstone districts in similar time frames. Chicago, devastated by the Great Fire of 1871, rebuilt itself into a modern metropolis within a decade and used the opportunity to invent the skyscraper while doing so. Melbourne, barely a settlement in 1840, became one of the richest cities on Earth by the 1880s, filled with grand Victorian architecture that still dominates its skyline today. The speed defies intuition. When we think of historical construction, we imagine cathedrals taking centuries, monuments requiring generations. Yet the Victorians built their greatest works in years, not decades. Take the Royal Albert Hall in London, conceived in 1867, completed in 1871. The Opéra Garnier in Paris, begun in 1861, finished in 1875, despite the Franco-Prussian War interrupting construction. The Brooklyn Bridge, started in 1869, opened in 1883, a marvel of engineering that still carries traffic today. These weren't simple structures. They featured intricate stonework, advanced engineering, innovative materials, and decoration that required master craftsmen. The Albert Hall's massive dome, the Opera's grand staircase and elaborate sculptures, the Brooklyn Bridge's suspension cables and Gothic arches. And here's what makes it truly puzzling. This was happening simultaneously across the industrializing world. It wasn't one city at a time, carefully planned and executed. It was dozens of cities, all building at once, all competing to create grander, more impressive architecture than their rivals. Modern architects and engineers look at Victorian construction records with a mix of admiration and disbelief.
The question they ask isn't whether it happened. The buildings still stand as proof. The question is, how did they physically accomplish this with the technology available? To understand the answer, we need to examine three things: the economic forces that drove this explosion, the innovations that made it possible, and the human cost that often gets forgotten in the admiration of the architecture. Chapter 2. The Economic Engine. The Victorian building boom didn't happen by accident. It was driven by economic forces so powerful they reshaped society itself. First, unprecedented capital accumulation. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just changing how things were made, it was creating wealth on a scale humanity had never seen. Factory owners, merchants, and financiers accumulated wealth that dwarfed anything in previous centuries. This wealth needed somewhere to go. Urban real estate became the investment of choice. Building rental properties, commercial spaces, and grand civic structures wasn't just about prestige, it was profitable. A well-located building could generate income for generations. Second, railway revolution. The expansion of rail networks made urban living feasible on a new scale. Workers could live miles from factories and commute daily. Building materials could be transported from quarries hundreds of miles away. Cities were no longer limited by how far a horse could walk in a day. Third, population pressure. Rural populations were flooding into cities seeking factory work. Between 1800 and 1900, England's urban population grew from 20% to 80% of the total. These people needed somewhere to live, and landlords were eager to meet that demand at a profit. Fourth, municipal ambition and nationalism. Cities competed for prestige. Vienna wanted to outdo Paris. New York aspired to rival London. Municipal governments issued bonds, borrowed heavily, and commissioned massive public works projects. The architecture wasn't just functional, it was propaganda, visual proof of a city's importance and modernity. Fifth, new financial instruments. The Victorians invented modern project financing. Government bonds, corporate stocks, and construction loans allowed projects to begin before full funding was secured. Developers could leverage future rents to finance present construction. The result was a perfect economic storm: abundant capital, cheap labor, advancing technology, and intense competition, all converging at once. But money alone doesn't explain the physical reality of construction. Having millions of pounds or dollars to spend is meaningless if you can't actually cut stone, lay brick, and erect structures fast enough. This is where the real mystery begins. Because the Victorians didn't just have money, they developed construction techniques so effective they're still not fully replicated today, despite our advanced machinery. The Victorian building boom required innovations in materials, techniques, and organization. Some are well known, others remain surprisingly obscure. The game changer was industrial-scale brick production. Early Victorian bricks were handmade, around 500 per worker per day. By the 1880s, mechanical brick presses could produce 25,000 bricks daily. A single factory could supply an entire district's construction needs. Portland cement, patented in 1824 and refined throughout the century, revolutionized construction. It was stronger, more consistent, and faster setting than traditional lime mortar. By the 1850s, it was being mass-produced, turning concrete from an ancient Roman technique into a modern industrial material. Cast iron and later steel allowed for internal frameworks that traditional stone architecture couldn't achieve. The Eiffel Tower, completed in 1889, demonstrated what was possible with prefabricated iron components assembled on site. Standardization. The Victorians invented modular construction. Window frames, door casings, decorative elements, floor joists, all were manufactured to standard dimensions in factories and assembled on site. This allowed relatively unskilled workers to assemble complex buildings like assembling furniture. Pattern books spread standardized designs across continents. An architect in Melbourne could order the same decorative elements as an architect in Manchester from the same catalog. Railway logistics. Construction materials could now be sourced globally. Portland stone from England's quarries reached New York. Italian marble decorated buildings in Chicago. Timber from the Scandinavian countries framed houses in London. But here's the innovation that rarely gets credit: organizational systems. The contractor system. Large construction firms emerged that could manage dozens of simultaneous projects. They employed permanent workforces, maintained tool inventories, negotiated bulk material purchases, and operated like modern corporations. These firms developed assembly line approaches to construction. Gangs of workers specialized in specific tasks: foundation teams, bricklayers, stone carvers, roofers, moving from site to site in coordinated sequences. This allowed a single contractor to have dozens of buildings in various stages of completion simultaneously. When you see photos,
Unlike previous eras, Victorian construction could continue after dark. Gas lighting allowed work to proceed in shifts. During peak building booms, some sites operated nearly 24 hours a day. Construction companies recruited directly from immigrant ships. Irish immigrants dominated construction gangs in America and Britain. Italian stonemasons brought specialized skills. Chinese workers built railways and infrastructure on the American West Coast. These weren't just workers, they were pre-trained craftsmen from traditional building cultures, bringing centuries-old skills to industrial-scale projects. The combination of industrial materials, standardized designs, logistics networks, organizational systems, and skilled immigrant labor created a construction machine unlike anything before it. But there's a dark side to this story that's often overlooked. The Victorian building boom was built on human suffering at a scale that's difficult to comprehend from our comfortable distance. Construction work in the 19th century was extraordinarily dangerous. Safety regulations didn't exist. Workers' compensation didn't exist. If you fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling stone, or died from injury infections, your family received nothing. Statistics are incomplete, but estimates suggest construction deaths in major projects ranged from 1 to 3% of the total workforce. The Brooklyn Bridge alone killed at least 27 workers, probably more, as many injuries led to deaths weeks or months later that weren't officially recorded. Caisson disease, the bends, crippled dozens of Brooklyn Bridge workers, including the chief engineer, Washington Roebling, who spent the final decade of construction supervising from his sickbed through a telescope. Working conditions were brutal. 12 to 16-hour days were standard. Pay was minimal, barely enough for food and lodging. Workers lived in overcrowded tenements, often sleeping in shifts in rented beds. Child labor was common. Boys as young as 8 or 9 worked as mortar boys, carrying heavy buckets of mortar up ladders to bricklayers. The light weight of children made them useful for dangerous tasks, like working on narrow scaffolding or in tight spaces. The seasonal nature of construction created feast or famine economics. Workers might earn decent wages during summer building season, then face unemployment and hunger during winter when construction stopped. Immigrant workers faced particular exploitation. Language barriers, desperation, and lack of legal protections made them vulnerable to wage theft, dangerous conditions, and discrimination. Construction bosses recruited directly from immigrant ships, offering immediate work to desperate new arrivals who had no alternatives. The stonework we admire today, those intricate carvings, precise joints, elaborate facades, was created by men breathing stone dust 12 hours a day. Silicosis, lung disease from inhaling dust, killed stoneworkers in their 40s and 50s. It was so common, it was called stoneworkers' consumption. Housing construction for workers was often as exploitative as the work itself. Developers built cheap tenements as fast as possible, cramming maximum occupants into minimum space.
Jacob Riis's photographs of New York tenements in the 1890s show conditions we'd now consider uninhabitable. Families of 8 in single rooms, no ventilation, shared outdoor toilets for dozens of families. Yet there's a paradox here worth noting. Despite the exploitation and danger, construction work offered opportunities that didn't exist in rural poverty or European oppression. Immigrants could earn money, learn skills, and gradually improve their situations. Some workers became contractors themselves. The Irish, Italian, and Jewish communities in American cities were built on construction wages. The Victorian building boom represented both the best and worst of industrial capitalism: extraordinary achievement alongside brutal exploitation, magnificent architecture built on human suffering, cities rising from the labor of people who could never afford to live in the buildings they constructed. This human cost is inseparable from the architecture we admire. Every Victorian building is a monument to both human ingenuity and human endurance. Here's an ironic twist. Despite our advanced technology, we couldn't replicate the Victorian building boom today. Not because we lack the capability, but because the conditions that made it possible and acceptable no longer exist. Modern building codes, safety regulations, environmental reviews, and permitting processes mean construction that took months in 1870 would take years today. This isn't necessarily bad. These regulations save lives and protect communities, but they do slow construction dramatically. Victorian construction was cheap because labor was cheap and safety was ignored. Modern construction must pay living wages, provide safety equipment, limit working hours, and carry insurance. This is morally right, but economically significant. In Victorian times, cities could expand freely into surrounding countryside. Today, urban land is phenomenally expensive, and much of the easy expansion space is already developed. Building on expensive land requires different economic calculations than building on cheap farmland. Victorian builders could source materials with little concern for environmental impact or sustainability. Modern construction must consider carbon footprints, sustainable sourcing, and environmental regulations. Victorian authorities could demolish entire neighborhoods with minimal public input. Baron Haussmann's renovation of Paris displaced hundreds of thousands of residents with no compensation or consultation. Today, historic preservation laws, community input requirements, and property rights make such sweeping changes impossible. The Victorian building boom wasn't a mystery in the conspiratorial sense. It was an extraordinary achievement driven by specific historical conditions. It required the convergence of industrial capital, technological innovation, mass immigration, global transportation networks, organizational systems, and a social order willing to tolerate brutal working conditions in pursuit of progress. The buildings remain as evidence not of lost civilizations or hidden technologies, but of what humanity can accomplish, for better and worse, when economic forces, technological change, and social transformation converge. When you walk through a Victorian city today, you're walking through a historical artifact as significant as any ancient ruins. These cities are monuments to the Industrial Revolution, testaments to human ambition, and reminders of the costs of rapid progress. The genuine mystery isn't how the buildings appeared. We have extensive records of exactly how they were built. The mystery is how societies organized themselves to accomplish such dramatic transformation in such compressed time frames. Understanding this requires no speculation or conspiracy theories. The truth is documented in construction logs, architectural drawings, newspaper accounts, photographs, census records, and the buildings themselves.